realtor wanted the building empty by the 15th, so I figured I'd start with the box nobody would actually want. My uncle's izakaya had been closed for 4 months by then, since the funeral, and everything in it still smelled like a business that expected to open again on Tuesday. The chairs were stacked, the taps were dry. In the back office, under a shelf of receipt books, there was a shoebox of cassette tapes, 40 or 50 of them, each one labeled in his handwriting, because my uncle never once in 30 years replaced the answering machine, bolted under the counter, with anything that didn't need a tape. I brought a laptop and a cheap adapter and told myself I'd digitize the lot before the estate sale, mostly so I wouldn't have to decide later whether they were worth keeping. It felt like the kind of task you give yourself when you don't want to think about the larger one. Sort tapes, label files, don't think about the room. It was well past midnight by the time I actually got the machine working again, and the kitchen still held a trace of dashi under the bleach smell, faint and stubborn, the way a smell gets into wood and doesn't leave when the people do. I noted it the way you note anything odd and small at that hour, filed it, moved on. The first dozen tapes were exactly what you'd expect from a small business run for 30 years by one careful man, regulars confirming a table for the usual 4, a supplier asking about a delivery window, someone canceling because of rain, apologizing twice, a woman asking if the plum wine was back in stock, and my uncle, on the callback he must have taped by accident, telling her yes, and to bring her mother next time, the way he apparently told her every single time. My uncle's own voice on the outgoing message, flat and a little formal, giving the hours, asking callers to leave a name and a time. I found myself smiling at some of it. It was warm, in its way, a record of a life that had mostly just been showing up, night after night, for people who kept coming back because he remembered what they drank. Some of the tapes were older than I expected. The labels faded to a color that wasn't quite any color, and I started keeping a running list in a notebook of my own date, tape number, whether anything on it was worth pulling out for the family before the rest got thrown away. It was tedious, in a way that felt almost restful. There is a kind of grief that prefers paperwork. You get to be useful instead of sad for exactly as long as the paperwork lasts. Near the bottom of the box was a tape with no label at all. Every other case in that box had his handwriting on the spine, a date, sometimes just initials, and this one was blank, the plastic a shade cleaner than the rest, like it hadn't sat in a drawer as long as the others had. I almost set it aside as blank stock, unused, not worth the time. It had weight to it though, the specific weight of a tape that has actually been recorded on. And I don't know why that was the detail that stopped my hand, instead of just moving to the next one. I turned the volume down before I played it, out of habit, the same habit you'd use on any of the others. The room was already quiet, quieter, somehow, once I'd decided to listen, instead of just letting it run in the background while I did something else. The machine made its small mechanical click, the one every tape on that deck made, tape catching, heads engaging. Nothing about that click was different. I want to be clear about that. Nothing about the machine told me to expect anything. My uncle's voice again. Same flat, business-like cadence as every other message on that tape. No more urgent than a note about a delivery window, a dinner reservation. Table for 2, he said, by the window, if it's free. No date given. No name repeated back the way he usually did to confirm it. Just that, logged the way you log any of the 50 things that come through a small restaurant's line in a week. And then the tape ran on to hiss and silence, the same as the others. I sat with the headphones still on for a while after it ended, 'cause it wasn't the content that bothered me. People make dinner reservations 'cause Small restaurants get calls like that 100 times a year, and my uncle answered every one of them the same way, whether it mattered or not. What bothered me was smaller and harder to argue with, and it took me a minute to find the shape of it. The phone line to that building had been disconnected over a month before I'd started sorting that box. I knew that because I was the one who'd called to cancel the service, sitting in a different room, going through his paperwork line by line, so nothing kept billing after he was gone. I went and found that paperwork again, in the same drawer as the reservation ledger, because that's where he'd have filed it. My uncle kept a drawer the way he kept everything dividers, dates written in the corner of each folder, nothing loose. It made it easy to find, which somehow made it worse. There was the confirmation letter from the water utility. There was the final electric bill, paid in full, a note in the margin about a meter reading. And there it was, the disconnection confirmation from the phone company, blue carbon copy, dated a full 5 weeks before tonight. His own signature at the bottom, in the same hand as everything else in that drawer. I checked it twice. I am not someone who reads dates wrong, and I wanted, badly, in that moment, to be exactly that kind of person for once. The answering machine itself had a small digital counter on the front, the kind that stamps a date and time onto each incoming message, a feature he'd been proud of when he installed it, back when it felt modern. It isn't a feature you can set by hand on that model. I checked the manual later, sitting on the floor of the office with a flashlight, because by then I wanted very badly to be wrong. The counter on that unlabeled tape read a date, 3 weeks after the disconnection, 3 weeks after there was no line for a call to travel down. I stood there for a while, doing the kind of math you do when you're hoping you've made an error somewhere upstream. I hadn't. I went out to the front of house after that, past the stacked chairs and the reservation ledger. The paper one he kept behind the register out of habit. Even after everyone started calling instead of writing in, that ledger was open on the counter to a page for a night that, as far as the calendar in my phone was concerned, hadn't happened yet. One table circled in his pen, a name written next to it in his hand, unhurried. The same handwriting from every cassette spine in that box, my own name. I did what I think anyone careful would do, which is try to rule it out one piece at a time. I checked my own phone for a missed call that night, any night, going back weeks, nothing, not from that number, not from any number I didn't recognize. I called the phone company's automated line myself from the parking lot, just to hear the disconnection date read back to me in a stranger's recorded voice, and it matched the paperwork exactly, unchanged, no error on file. Go. I told myself the counter could have glitched, reset itself somehow, and I checked that too, standing in the cold with the manual open on my phone, non-resettable, without a full factory wipe. And this machine, according to the service sticker on its underside, had never been opened since the day it was installed. I even considered, for a while, that someone was doing this to me on purpose. A cousin with a spare key, some elaborate, unkind joke about the inheritance, though I couldn't think of a single person who'd know that machine well enough to fake its counter, or who'd bother learning my uncle's handwriting to fill in a ledger line. That explanation cost more effort to believe than the alternative, which is its own kind of answer. Give. Each explanation I reached for closed as I reached for it, quietly, the way a door closes when nobody's pushing it, just settling into its frame, because that's what it was already doing. I went back inside. I don't fully know why. I sat down at the circled table in the dark, surrounded by chairs that were stacked everywhere except around that one, and the smell of dashi was stronger there than it had been anywhere else in the building all night, not the stale, stubborn trace from the kitchen earlier, but something closer to fresh, like a pot, had been on a burner an hour ago instead of 4 months. I sat there long enough for it to feel less like a discovery and more like waiting, though I couldn't have told you what for, or whether I was early or unforgivably late. I don't know which night the reservation is for. I don't know if it already happened, in whatever sense a call from a disconnected line can happen, or if it's still sitting open. The way a held table sits open past the hour, anyone reasonable would expect the guest to arrive. I thought about calling someone, a friend, my mother, anyone who'd known him, just to say the sentence out loud and hear how it sounded outside my own head. I didn't. Some things get smaller when you say them, and some things get more true, and I wasn't ready to find out which this was. I packed the tapes back into the shoebox for the realtor anyway, taped the lid down myself, and carried it to the car. When I came back in for one last look at the register, the ledger was open on the counter again, to that same circled page, though I hadn't touched it, and though the shoebox with the tapes was already sitting closed and taped in the trunk of my car. I don't have an explanation for that either. I locked the door behind me, the slow, careful way you do when you still might come back, not the quick, final way you lock a door on a place you're finished with for good. And my uncle answered every one of them the same way, whether it mattered or not. What bothered me was smaller and harder.